The train pulled into Delwood Station 11 minutes late, which felt like a bad omen to almost everyone waiting on the platform. It was the third week of October 1887, and the air had already turned mean, the kind of cold that didn't announce itself politely, but pressed against exposed skin with the patience of something that knew it would win eventually. The mountains to the northwest were capped white. The cottonwoods along the creek had shed half their leaves. The sky was the pale, hard blue of a held breath. Elias Crow stood at the far end of the platform with his hat in his hands, turning the brim in slow circles the way he did when he was trying not to show he was nervous. He was 41 years old, wide in the shoulder, and weathered in the way that men who spent most of their lives outdoors became weathered. Not dramatically, not the way it looked in dime novels, but gradually, like a fence post left through too many winters. His beard needed trimming. His coat had a torn pocket he kept forgetting to mend. He'd shaved that morning, at least. That much he'd managed. He hadn't told anyone he was coming to the station. Not his hired hand, Cord. Not his neighbor Ruth Plank, who would have had 14 opinions about it. Not anyone. He'd driven the wagon in alone, tied the horses to the post near the grain merchants, and walked to the platform like a man heading to the dentist, determined and dreading it in equal measure. He had the letter in his coat pocket. He'd read it so many times the fold lines were soft as cloth. Miss Hazel Whitmore, 28 years of age, Boston, Massachusetts. Industrious, literate, in good health. Experienced in household management, eager for honest frontier life. The agency had also sent a small photograph, a cabinet card, slightly blurred at the edges. The woman in it had a round face and a cautious expression, like she wasn't sure the camera was going to behave. Elias had looked at that photograph for a long time the night it arrived. Not because she was beautiful. She wasn't particularly, or at least the photograph didn't present her that way, but because she looked like someone who was thinking hard about something and hadn't reached a conclusion yet. He'd found that oddly reassuring. He didn't need beautiful. He needed someone who could think. What he hadn't anticipated, what the photograph had not prepared him for, was her size. Hazel Whitmore was a heavy woman. Not broadly, not in a way that could be explained away as sturdy or substantial. She was large in the way that people noticed immediately and made decisions about just as fast. She was the third person off the train, carrying a brown leather bag in one hand and a tapestry satchel in the other, wearing a gray wool traveling coat that looked like it had been good quality once and had since endured a great deal. Her dark hair was pinned back under a small hat that was slightly crooked. She stopped at the edge of the platform and looked around with the careful, deliberate attention of someone trying to orient themselves without appearing lost. Elias recognized her from the photograph. He moved toward her. "Miss Whitmore." She turned. Up close, her eyes were a deep, steady brown, and she was studying him with the same careful attention she'd given the platform. "Mr. Crow." "Yes." He took her bag without asking. She let him, which he appreciated. Some women would have made a whole event of it. "Welcome to Delwood." "Thank you." She looked at the station, the unpaved main street beyond it, the mountains in the distance. Her expression was impossible to read. "It's very far from Boston, I expect." "I was going to say large," she said. "The sky. It's a great deal of sky." He glanced up, as if checking that the sky was still there. "Gets bigger in winter." She didn't respond to that immediately. Then, "That's either reassuring or alarming." "Both," he said, and started walking toward the wagon. The ride out to the ranch took nearly 2 hours, most of it over roads that didn't deserve the name, rutted tracks through scrub and sage, cutting across land that seemed indifferent to human presence. Elias drove and Hazel sat beside him on the bench, her satchel in her lap, watching the landscape pass. He'd expected conversation, or maybe silence. He could have managed either. What he hadn't expected was that she would ask questions, practical questions. How many head of cattle? 63 right now. Was 80 before last winter. What happened? Hard winter. Lost some to the cold, some to a sickness I couldn't identify in time. The rest... He stopped. The rest I had to sell to cover the feed costs for the ones that survived. She was quiet a moment. "Do you have a root cellar?" "A small one. Not well stocked." "What about the hay situation for this winter?" He looked at her sideways. "You know about hay?" "I know about logistics," she said without embarrassment. I kept the household accounts for my father's business for 6 years. Feed costs are feed costs, whether it's horses or factory equipment. Do you have enough? He turned back to the road. Not as much as I'd like. That's a problem. Yes, he said. It is. Another long silence. The wagon wheels found a particularly deep rut, and both of them lurched. Hazel grabbed the bench with one hand, steadied herself, and didn't make a sound. The agency letter said you were experienced in household management, Elias said. I was. I am. Boston Household Management. She paused. I can cook. I can sew. I can keep accounts and manage a budget. I've never milked a cow. I've never preserved meat for winter. And I've never been on horseback. A beat. I thought honesty was better than finding out later. He appreciated that too, in the same way he'd appreciated her not making a production of the bag. It is, he said. The agency letter said you had a prosperous ranch, Hazel said. He felt the back of his neck get warm. I said building toward prosperous. She didn't say anything else for a while. Then, quietly, I suppose we both arrived expecting something somewhat different. I suppose we did. The mountains were close enough now that he could see the individual ridge lines, the dark cuts of pine, the first real snow already settled above the tree line. He'd lived here for 11 years. He still thought it was the most beautiful and most punishing country he'd ever seen. Can you learn? He asked, finally. The things you don't know? Are you willing to learn them? Hazel considered that with what he was beginning to recognize as her characteristic patience. Not slowness, not hesitation, but the kind of deliberate thinking that meant she took her answers seriously. Yes, she said. If someone will teach me. He nodded. Can you? She asked. He looked at her. Teach me, she clarified. Do you have the patience for it? Elias thought about the last 3 years alone on that ranch, the isolation, the small disasters, the way the silence could press on a man until it felt physical. He thought about the mare who'd foaled badly in July, and the calf he'd lost to a late freeze in May, and the fence line on the north pasture that still needed mending. He thought about how many things he'd been managing alone and managing badly. I'll make the time, he said. The ranch announced itself modestly. A barn, a house, 2 outbuildings, a yard that needed work. The house was built of timber and had a porch that had been repaired twice in ways that didn't quite match. There was a kitchen garden that had gone ragged at the end of the season, a woodpile that needed adding to, a water trough that needed scrubbing. Cord, the hired hand, was in the yard when the wagon pulled in. He was 23 and tended toward bluntness without meaning harm by it. He took in Hazel Whitmore with the uncomplicated directness of someone who hadn't yet learned to disguise his assessments. Oh, he said. Cord, Elias said, with a particular flatness in his voice that Cord had learned to respect. This is Mrs. Crow. Hazel climbed down from the wagon without assistance. She'd figured out during the trip that the step was too far for a graceful descent and had simply decided not to attempt gracefulness. She looked at Cord steadily. Hello? Ma'am? He managed, and went back to what he'd been doing with exaggerated focus. She followed Elias inside. The kitchen was cold and smelled of wood ash. There was a table, 2 chairs, a cast-iron stove, and shelves that needed organizing. Through the doorway, she could see a sitting area with a settle and a rifle hung above the mantel. The bedroom off the back had a bed with a reasonable quilt and a second blanket folded on the foot. There's only one bedroom, he said. He wasn't sure how to address this without making it more awkward than it already was. I can see that, Hazel said, setting her bags down. We're married. I expect we'll manage. She said it matter-of-factly, which was the only way she seemed to say anything. Then she looked at the stove. Does that behave? It drafts low in bad weather. You have to open the side vent before your sheets. Show me, she said. He showed her. That first week was an education in mutual mortification. Hazel's attempts at the wood stove produced 2 meals that were edible and 1 that was not, and she said so herself before he could find a diplomatic way to mention it. The iron, the cooking iron, the laundry iron, all of it, operated on principles that her Boston kitchen had not prepared her for. She burned her hand twice. She did not cry about it, which he noticed. The animals were a separate catastrophe. She was afraid of the horses at first. Not in a screaming, theatrical way, but in the careful, controlled way of someone who recognized they were out of their depth and was managing the fear rather than surrendering to it. The milk cow, a stolid animal named Patience, suffered her early efforts with bovine resignation. The chickens were openly contemptuous. Elias taught what he knew and discovered in the process that he was not a natural teacher. He moved through tasks too quickly, assumed knowledge she didn't have, and twice caught himself speaking with an impatience he was ashamed of the moment he heard it in his own voice. The second time it happened, he stopped himself mid-sentence. "I'm going about this wrong," he said. "You are," Hazel agreed pleasantly. "But you're aware of it, which helps. Try again." He tried again, slower. And she learned faster than he expected, which helped. What she could do, it turned out, was read. She'd brought 4 books in those bags, which he'd initially found absurd, and one of them was a practical guide to frontier homesteading that she began working through with methodical attention. She cross-referenced it against their specific situation, asked him clarifying questions with the precision of someone used to keeping accurate accounts, and began implementing small changes in how the household ran that he noticed without fully acknowledging. The butter production improved because she'd read about temperature and worked out where the coolest spot in the kitchen was. The fire held longer because she'd asked Cord about the different wood types available, and he'd told her, uncertain why she was asking but willing enough to answer. She started a list, a long, specific list, of what they needed before winter, ranked by urgency and estimated cost. He found the list one morning folded on the table. "You went through the accounts," he said. "You left them on the shelf. I assumed they were available." She was working the churn steadily, not looking at him. "You've been underpaying on the feed supplier. He's charging you above the rate he posts in the Delwood register. I noticed it in September, October, and November of last year." Elias stared at her. "How much?" "Nearly $40 over those 3 months. I'd need to see the full year to tell you total." He sat down. "Get the full year." "What?" The town of Delwood had approximately 340 people and the social metabolism of a much smaller community. News moved fast and settled in. Word of Hazel Whitmore's arrival, her appearance, her manner, the whole situation, spread through the community with the thoroughness of water finding every crack. The women at the dry goods counter discussed her. The men at the feed merchants had opinions. Ruth Plank, who had the authority of a woman who'd been in the territory for 20 years and lost 2 husbands to it, held court at her kitchen table on the subject. "A mail-order bride," Ruth said, to the 2 women who had come for coffee and to hear what Ruth thought. Fine enough practice when a man has no other options. But Elias Crow went and ordered one from Boston. She said it the way people said the name of a city they'd never been to but had decided to resent. A Boston woman, soft as bread dough, never done a hard day's work in her life, and twice the size she ought to be for the work that needs doing. "She might surprise you," said the younger woman, a farmer's wife named Clara Hess, who had not yet learned that saying this sort of thing to Ruth Plank was pointless. "She'll be back in Boston before February," Ruth said. Montana winters cure optimism fast. The first time Hazel came to Delwood, for supplies, riding beside Elias on the wagon bench, she felt the looks. She wasn't a stupid woman. She knew what she looked like. She knew what they were thinking, and she was not naive enough to pretend otherwise. She bought what they needed, said please and thank you, answered questions directly when they were asked, and did not explain herself to anyone. On the way home, Elias said, "Ruth Plank was watching you from her window." "I know. She's not—" He stopped. "She's a difficult woman." "Most places have someone like her," Hazel said. "It's not interesting enough to worry about." He looked at her. "I mean that sincerely," she said. "I didn't come all the way to Montana to spend energy on someone else's opinion of me. I have too much work to do." November hit hard. The temperature dropped in a way that was less like weather and more like a judgment. Hazel had read about Montana winters. Reading about them was not the same as waking up in a house where the water in the pitcher had frozen overnight, or going out to the barn in the dark with cold so deep it made her eyes ache, or working through an afternoon where the wind came off the mountains with the consistency of something with a specific intention. She was cold all the time. Not uncomfortable cold, genuinely, bone-deep cold, the kind she'd never experienced in Boston. The kind that made her understand for the first time why people didn't survive out here without knowing exactly what they were doing. She made mistakes. She left the barn door improperly latched one night, and the wind got it. Not a disaster, but Elias had to go out and secure it at 2 in the morning, and she heard him come back in, and she lay still in the darkness, feeling the particular weight of having caused someone else unnecessary work. She said nothing about it, and he said nothing about it, but she lay there a long time thinking about the latch, and the way she'd done it wrong, and what the correct way was. She didn't do it wrong again. Elias was not an easy man to live with. He was interior. He kept himself to himself in a way that wasn't coldness exactly, but wasn't ease either. He'd been alone a long time, and the shape of him had arranged itself around solitude. He forgot to say things that should be said. He would spend an entire evening in the chair by the fire saying nothing, turning a piece of harness leather over in his hands, and she'd sit across from him reading, and it was not unpleasant, actually, strangely companionable, but she never quite knew what he was thinking. "Do you regret it?" she asked him one evening in November. She hadn't planned to ask. The words just came. He looked up from the leather. "Regret what?" "The arrangement. Me. All of it." He thought about it. She'd learned he always thought before he answered, which she respected, even when the wait was uncomfortable. "No," he said. "Do you?" "I haven't decided yet," she said. He almost smiled. She saw the corner of his mouth move. "Fair enough," he said, and looked back at the leather. By December, she could handle the stove without instruction, milk patients in under 20 minutes, and manage the chicken coop well enough that the hens had stopped treating her with open disdain. She was learning to bake bread in the cast iron, which was its own particular science, and she'd worked out a preservation system for the root cellar that Elias admitted with visible reluctance was better organized than what he'd had before. She still couldn't ride properly. The horse, a patient bay mare named Dora, seemed to tolerate her without enthusiasm. Elias spent 2 afternoons working with her on it, out in the yard, patient in a way that surprised her, and she improved, slowly, without ever achieving anything that could be called grace. Her body was not built for sitting a horse elegantly, and she had accepted that and focused instead on sitting it safely, which was the more important thing. Cord had warmed to her, in his inarticulate way. He started saying good morning without being spoken to first, which was progress. He told her once, with the air of someone paying a serious compliment, that she worked harder than he'd expected. "What did you expect?" she asked. He looked at his boots. "Less." "Most people did," she said without heat. "It's all right, just keep revising." She didn't know, that December, what was coming. None of them did. The winter had been hard but manageable, the ranch operating at the thin edge of viable, her marriage operating at something that was not yet warmth, but was more than arrangement. She was learning. She was surviving. Some morning she stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the snow-covered yard and the mountains beyond, and felt something close to a claim on the place. Not ownership exactly, but the beginning of belonging. It was not enough to make her ready for what January would bring. Yet, the first week of January, one of Elias's breeding mares, a big dark animal named Kettle, who had a temper and a history of complicated foalings, was discovered to be further along in her pregnancy than anyone had calculated. She was also, as of that morning, showing the kinds of signs that meant the foal wasn't positioned right. Elias spent an hour with her, checking, frowning, checking again. Hazel stood outside the stall and watched him work with the focused competence of a man who knew animals. "How bad?" she asked. "She needs to be somewhere warm and quiet for the next couple of weeks. The foal's not presenting right yet. There's still time for it to turn. But if she foals out there," he gestured toward the north pasture where Kettle had been running, "in this cold, without someone there, she has to stay in the barn. The barn's already tight, but yes. What do you need me to do?" He looked at her. Whatever he saw, the steadiness of it, maybe, seemed to settle something. "I need you to check on her at night. I can't be up every 2 hours and still run the ranch during the day. If you can take the second half of the night, I can do that." "It's cold," he said, meaning the walk to the barn at 2, 3 in the morning. "I noticed," she said. "Tell me what signs to watch for." He told her. She listened with the focused attention she gave everything and asked 3 questions that told him she'd understood. He felt something he hadn't expected to feel. Relief. The plain physical relief of not being the only person who knew what needed doing. For 2 weeks, she got up in the frozen dark and walked to the barn. Some nights nothing happened. Kettle was restless but stable, and Hazel would stand in the lamplight with the cold pressing in around the barn walls and listen to the mare breathe and the other animals settle and the wind move over the roof. Some nights Kettle was difficult, pacing, distressed, and Hazel would stay longer, sitting on a hay bale with the lamp turned down, talking to the mare in a low voice. She wasn't sure if it helped Kettle. It helped her. The foal turned. By mid-January, Kettle was presenting correctly. Elias said, "Good news." "Yes," Hazel said. "You didn't have to get up every night," he said. "You could have woken me. You needed to sleep." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't quite categorize. Not gratitude. He wasn't a gratitude out loud kind of man. Something quieter. Some recognition. "Thank you," he said. She nodded. "There's a storm coming," she said. She'd been watching the sky for 3 days, comparing it against what she'd read. "A big one. I think we have about a week." He looked north. "Maybe less," he said. She thought about the list she needed to update. The hay, the firewood, the supplies in the root cellar, the mare with the foal almost ready to come, and the north pasture, and the fences, and everything that would need to be done before the weather made it impossible. "Then we should start today," she said. Outside, the mountains held their silence, and the sky was the white, heavy, particular white of a winter that had not yet shown what it was capable of. But that was coming. That was most definitely coming. The storm she'd predicted came in 6 days, not 7. It arrived the way serious weather always did in that country. Not dramatically, not with any of the theatrical buildup that would have given them more time, but quietly, the way a door closes when someone is trying not to wake the house. One morning, the sky was the usual hard gray of January, and by afternoon it had lowered itself to something almost suffocating, a flat white ceiling pressing down on the mountains until the peaks disappeared entirely. The temperature dropped 8 degrees in 2 hours. Elias felt it in his hands before the thermometer confirmed it. "We have maybe 4 hours before it gets bad," he said, coming in from checking the sky. Hazel was already at the table with the list. She'd been adding to it all week, a running account of what needed doing, ranked by urgency, with notes beside each item that indicated what she'd already started on, and what still required his particular knowledge or strength. She pushed it across the table to him without a word. He read it. He read it again, more carefully. "The north fence," he said. "Cord can get the 2 sections nearest the gate. I already talked to him this morning." "You talked to Cord about the fence?" "About the sections I could identify as loose from what I've seen. You'd know better than me which others need attention." She wasn't being defensive about it. She said it as a statement of fact, the same way she said everything. "What am I missing?" He looked at the list. The hay bales were already moved from the outer stack to the sheltered side of the barn. He'd noticed that yesterday and not asked who'd done it. The water barrels were covered. The root cellar door had a new wooden block to keep it from blowing open, which he didn't remember installing. "The chicken coop," he said. "The east wall lets air in. I patched it Tuesday. Cord helped me hold the board." He set the list down. He was quiet for a moment. "You've been doing this all week." "We had a week," she said. "Or close to it." "I thought you said a week." "I said about a week." She stood and went to check the stove. It came faster. We still managed. He watched her adjust the damper with the practiced efficiency she'd developed over 3 months. No longer tentative, no longer checking twice before touching it. He thought about the Hazel Whitmore, who had arrived at Delwood Station in October, the one who hadn't known how a draft worked, and had been afraid of the horses, and had stood in the kitchen looking at the cast-iron stove like it was a problem she wasn't sure she could solve. That woman was still here, technically. She just had a great deal more information now. The storm hit fully overnight, and by morning the world outside was white in every direction, and the wind was the kind that made the house feel small in an unpleasant way. Not cozy, not sheltered, but exposed, like the wind knew there was something warm inside and was looking for a way in. The temperature settled at something Hazel couldn't fully comprehend, having no prior scale for it. The water in the kitchen pitcher didn't just frost at the edges, it froze solid. "This is January," Elias said, coming in from the barn with ice in his beard and his hands red past the wrists. "This is a regular January storm." "You say that like it's normal." "It is normal." He stood by the stove until some of the color came back into his hands. "Wait until February." She handed him a cup of coffee. He took it without a word, which was as close to thank you as he got in those early months, and she'd learned to read the particular silence that meant gratitude versus the particular silence that meant he was thinking about something else. Outside, Cord was managing the animals, the feeding, the watering, the checking of every animal in the barn. Hazel had taken on the barn duties enough times by now that she understood the system, but in a storm like this, 2 people moving through it at once were better, and Cord was faster and more experienced in the cold. She stayed in the kitchen and worked, mending that needed doing, more organized thinking about the supply situation, bread that they were going to need to have ready because they wouldn't be going anywhere for at least 2 days. The bread was still a negotiation. She'd improved substantially since October, but the cast iron ran hot in unpredictable ways, and she'd learned that what she thought of as adequate rising time wasn't always what the dough thought of as adequate rising time, and there was still a gap between her and reliable. She managed it. 2 loaves came out of that morning's baking with reasonable crusts and interiors that were cooked through, which felt like a victory she didn't announce but quietly noted. Elias ate 2 thick slices with the soup she'd kept on the back of the stove and said nothing, which she'd learned meant it was fine. "I need to check the east fence line when this breaks," he said, into the silence that was comfortable between them now in a way it hadn't been in October. "When do you think it'll break?" "Tomorrow night, maybe the night after." She calculated. The supplies would hold. The animals were sheltered. The wood was in. She thought about Kettle, who was in the barn with the foal still gestating, who was still weeks away from her due date, but whose due date she'd been tracking more carefully than Elias probably realized. "Kettle was restless last night," she said. He looked at her. "You were out there last night?" "At 2. She settled around 3. She had not mentioned this because she hadn't thought it required mentioning. She'd taken on the nighttime checks, and she did them. He looked at his coffee cup. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to," she said quietly but without apology. "I want to know if something goes wrong before it gets worse. That's just sense." He didn't argue with it. He finished the coffee, and she started on what needed doing in the afternoon. When the storm broke 2 days later, the world emerged with the kind of still, crystalline clarity that almost made you forget what it had just done to you. The snow was deep, past the knee in the yard, drifted to the eaves on the north side of the barn, erasing the lower portions of the fence lines entirely. Delwood would have news, Hazel knew. There was always news after a storm in a small settlement. Who'd lost animals, who'd lost a roof section, who'd managed, and who hadn't. Elias drove in for supplies on the 3rd day after the storm, and she went with him, which she'd started doing more regularly now. Not because she needed to, but because she found the trips useful. She was learning the town, learning who mattered, and how and why. Learning the map of relationships and histories that governed every small community, whether it wanted to admit it or not. Ruth Plank was at the dry goods store when they came in. She was a compact woman of 55 with the posture of someone who had decided, decades ago, that she would not be moved. She looked at Hazel with the assessing look she apparently gave everything and said, "You made it through the storm." "We did," Hazel said. "A lot of people thought you'd be back in Boston by now." She said it without cruelty, just statement. "I know," Hazel said. "You're heavier than makes sense for this kind of life," Ruth said. There was a particular silence in the store. The man behind the counter found something to look at on the far shelf. Elias went very still. Hazel looked at Ruth Plank without changing her expression. "I'm aware of what I look like," she said. "And I'm still here." Ruth held her gaze for a moment. Then something shifted in the older woman's face. Not warmth, not quite, but a fractional recalibration. She nodded once, the way people nod when they've received an answer they didn't expect. "So you are," she said, and turned back to her own business. Walking to the wagon afterward, Elias said, "You handled that better than I would have." "She's testing," Hazel said. "People like Ruth Plank don't actually want you to leave. They want to know if you're real." She climbed up onto the wagon bench, which she managed now without the graceless struggle of October. "I'm real." February arrived and validated every warning anyone had given her about February. The cold became something else entirely. Not weather, but condition. Not temporary, but seemingly permanent. The days were short and gray, and the nights were long and vicious, and the work never stopped because the cold didn't care about exhaustion or muscle ache or the fact that her hands were cracked at every knuckle and bled in the dry air, no matter how much tallow she worked into them before bed. She was learning, but learning hurt. Every skill had a cost in this country, and the cost was always paid in cold or effort or both. The writing was the hardest. Not because she was afraid of Dora anymore. She'd worked past the fear through the simple application of spending time with the mare, feeding her by hand, standing in the stall talking to her until the animal accepted her presence without tension. But her body on horseback remained a problem that patience alone couldn't solve. She sat wrong. She gripped wrong. After an hour in the saddle, she was in genuine pain in her hips and lower back, a deep grinding ache that persisted through the evening and made sleeping difficult. She didn't stop. She adjusted. She asked Elias twice to watch her and tell her what she was doing that she shouldn't be, and he watched her with the particular frown he got when he was thinking hard about something, and he told her, and she tried to change it. "You're fighting the horse," he said, the second afternoon of watching. They were in the yard, and the cold was serious, and his breath was a visible cloud. "You're trying to make your body hold a shape instead of letting the horse's movement." He stopped. He could see this wasn't landing the way he meant it. He got his own horse, a big gray gelding named Seven, and mounted. "Watch what my hips are doing." She watched. It took her 3 more sessions before she felt what she was watching, felt it in her own body rather than just seeing it in his. The day she finally understood it, the day it clicked from intellectual knowledge into muscle knowledge, she was alone, riding the fence line on the east pasture, and Dora moved underneath her in a different way than she had before. Or maybe it was just that Hazel finally stopped resisting it, and for about 40 feet the whole thing was easy. She didn't tell Elias. She didn't know why. It felt private. March brought mud, which was in some ways worse than the snow. A deep, adhesive, boot-stealing mud that turned every path to the barn into an effort and made the yard look like something a person couldn't take seriously as a home. It also brought the first signs that some things survived winter and intended to make something of spring, which she clung to with more feeling than she expected. She'd planted seeds in a tray in the kitchen window in late February. Tomatoes and peppers and herbs she'd ordered from a catalog. Elias had looked at the seed catalog with the expression of a man uncertain whether to say the thing he was thinking. "What?" she'd said. "It's not exactly the best gardening climate in the territory." "I know. The catalog says what conditions each variety needs. I ordered accordingly." He'd looked at the list she'd circled. "Those are short-season varieties." "Yes?" "You researched this." It seemed worth doing correctly. She'd looked at him. "Do you have an objection?" He'd shaken his head. Not objection. Something else. The same quality of whatever it was that crossed his face sometimes when she did something he hadn't anticipated. Not surprise exactly. More like the feeling of a revised estimate. The seedlings came up in March, pale green and improbable in the window, while everything outside was still winter-colored, and she checked them with the same attention she gave everything that required consistent effort. Elias never mentioned them. But she noticed that he moved his chair slightly in the evenings so that the lamp didn't throw its shadow across the window. In town, she was becoming known, which was different from being liked but wasn't nothing. The Women's Auxiliary, a loose collective of ranch wives and merchants' wives who organized the practical social infrastructure of Delwood, held a meeting in March. And Clara Hess, the farmer's wife who'd once made the futile suggestion to Ruth Plank that Hazel might surprise her, mentioned to Hazel that she was welcome to come. "I'm not sure what I'd contribute," Hazel said honestly. "Can you read?" Clara asked. "Of course." "Can you keep minutes?" "Yes." "Then you're more useful than half the people already there," Clara said. She went. She sat in the back and listened for the first half, which was her instinct in any new social environment. Learn the rules before you play. The meeting was about a dispute over shared water rights on the creek that ran through 3 properties, and it had been going in circles for the better part of an hour, when Hazel finally said, without fully planning to, "Has anyone actually looked at the original land survey?" The room turned to look at her. She felt the attention of it, waited, evaluating. The survey would specify where the water boundary sits, she said, keeping her voice level. If there's a legal document that establishes the baseline, the argument becomes a great deal simpler. A pause. Then a woman named Addie Graves said, "The county recorder has the survey. Nobody's thought to pull it." "That seems like the obvious first step," Hazel said. The survey was pulled the following week. It settled 2 of the 3 points in dispute within an hour. Clara Hess told Hazel afterward, with the frank admiration of someone who didn't waste compliments, "You saved us 3 more meetings of that." Hazel said she was glad to help, but she felt, walking back to the wagon, the specific warmth of having been useful in a room that had not expected it from her. She stored that feeling carefully. She'd learned to store things carefully out here. Warmth, progress, small victories. The winters were long, and you needed reserves. April, and the grass came back, and with it the hardest sustained stretch of work she'd yet experienced. Spring on a cattle ranch was not the seasonal relief it was in other kinds of life. It was the opposite, a compressed and relentless period where everything that had been deferred by winter came due simultaneously. Calving season started, which meant that the ranch's already thin margin between viable and not was being actively determined in barns and pastures by the willingness of cows to deliver healthy calves and the survival rate of what arrived. Elias was barely inside during April. He slept in short stretches, ate fast, and moved with the focused efficiency of a man who knew exactly how much was at stake and was not interested in conversation about it. Hazel took on everything else: the house, the kitchen, the chicken coop, the garden preparation, managing Cord's daily schedule when Elias wasn't available to direct it, and making sure that the meals she put on the table at whatever hour Elias came in were something he could actually eat rather than something she'd had to throw out. She also helped with the calving. This had not been discussed or negotiated. One night in the second week of April, Elias came in at 10 o'clock, bone-tired and moving slowly, and said that one of the heifers was having trouble and he needed to go back out, and Hazel had already put on her coat. "You don't need to," he said. "I know," she said, and went. She'd read the section on difficult calvings twice, and she'd watched Elias manage 2 already, and she knew the limits of what she could do versus what required his strength and experience. But she could hold a lantern steady. She could pass him what he needed without him having to ask twice. She could stay calm when the animal was frightened and the situation was bad, which was its own contribution. Panic was contagious. Steadiness was too. They lost 1 calf that April, a small bull that hadn't been positioned right and hadn't survived, and she watched Elias stand over it for a moment in the barn with an expression that had nothing performative in it, just the plain, tired look of someone absorbing a loss they'd been trying to prevent. He crouched and put a hand on the animal, briefly. Then he stood and went to check on the cow. She didn't say anything comforting. She didn't think he wanted that. She picked up the lantern and followed him. Looked out. May and the seedlings went into the ground. She'd prepared the kitchen garden bed herself, turned the soil, worked in compost from the pile Cord managed behind the barn, checked the drainage by watching where the runoff went during the April rains. Elias watched her do it from the porch one afternoon and offered no comment, which she took as non-objection. The garden was partly practical. Fresh vegetables in summer would reduce supply costs and improve nutrition in a way that mattered at their income level. But it was also something else, something she didn't say aloud. It was hers. The barn was a joint venture, the house was shared, the animals were the ranch's. The garden she'd ordered from, planned and prepared by herself, and what grew there would be partly the result of her specific choices. The first things to come up were the radishes, fast, irreverent, unstoppable, and she stood over them one morning in May with her hands dirty and the sun finally warm on her back and felt something she could only have described as ferocious. Clara Hess came to visit in May, which was a first. She brought her daughter, a girl of 12 named Bess, who looked at everything on the ranch with the intense curiosity of a child who had been brought to see something specific and was not yet sure what it was. Hazel showed her the seedlings and explained what she'd done with the soil, and Bess asked 3 good questions in a row. And Clara watched this with an expression Hazel recognized because she'd seen it on Elias, that particular look of revised estimate. "Ruth Plank said something about you last week," Claire said, when Bess had gone off to examine the chickens. "Did she?" "She said you were tougher than you looked." A pause. For Ruth, that's close to an apology. Hazel looked at her seedlings. I'll take it, she said. The summer ground them down in a different way than winter had, relentlessly physical, sun-soaked, the work expanding to fill every available hour. Hazel's hands lost whatever remained of their Boston softness and became the hands of someone who worked outdoors, which she examined one evening in July with a kind of curious attention rather than grief. She'd been a different person in Boston, not a worse one, necessarily, but a person whose body had been decorative in the way that bodies are when they aren't required to do anything specific. This body was required to do a great deal of things, and it was complying, and that felt like information about what she'd been capable of all along. She was still heavy, that wasn't changing, but she was heavy in the way that a draft horse is heavy. Functionally, usefully, with a foundation of strength she'd built week by week through the accumulation of every morning she'd gone to the barn, and every afternoon she'd spent in the garden, and every time she'd gotten back on Dora even when her hips ached. Cord started asking her things. Not about ranch operations, that was Elias's domain, and Cord respected it, but about other things. Whether she thought the new rope bridle arrangement would work, whether she thought they should separate the yearlings earlier, whether she thought the feed merchant was trustworthy, which made her laugh because she'd figured out the answer to that question in January. No, she told him about the feed merchant. Keep checking the rate against the register. You know he's been overcharging Elias for 3 years? I know it was at least a year before I got here. Elias is working it out with him. She'd stayed out of that negotiation, deliberately. It was Elias's business relationship to repair or end, but she'd given him every figure, every discrepancy, every comparison she'd tracked down. Cord nodded, satisfied. Then he said, with the air of someone deciding to say something he'd been holding, "When you first came, I thought—" "I know what you thought," she said. "Yeah." He looked at the fence he was mending. "Well, I was wrong." "You were working from available information," she said. "So was everyone else." She handed him the next board. "It's fine. Just keep updating." Shot. By August, Kettle's foal was a leggy, bad-tempered filly who kicked anything within range and was already showing the mare's disposition, which Elias regarded as both a problem and a point of pride. Hazel had named her Thorn, which he'd objected to briefly on the grounds that it was an inauspicious name for a foaling animal. "She earned it," Hazel had said, watching the filly dodge Cord's hand for the 3rd time in a row. "She's 4 months old." She knew what she was doing at 3. He hadn't argued further. Thorn she was. The name, like everything else about this year, had been argued over and then accepted, worked with, made to fit. That was how things worked here. You didn't get the frontier to accommodate you. You accommodated it, and then slowly you found the things you could shape to fit what you needed, and then you shaped them. She was still learning. She expected she would be learning for a long time. But she was no longer a woman arriving off a train with a bag in each hand and a Boston understanding of how the world worked. She was something else now. Something that didn't have a clean name, but that stood in the yard in August watching a bad-tempered filly kick at a fence post and felt, without question, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Elias came out of the barn and stood beside her, watching Thorn demonstrate her ongoing objection to the fence. "She's going to be a problem," he said. "She's going to be exceptional," Hazel said. He was quiet. Then, "You think that about difficult things? Usually difficult things are worth more. They just take longer to prove it." He looked at her, the sideways look he had, the one that wasn't quite profile and wasn't quite direct. The one that she'd learned meant he was thinking something he hadn't fully decided whether to say. He didn't say it, but she felt it anyway, the way you feel something when the air in a room changes, a shift in the temperature of his attention, subtle and real, and something she tucked away with the rest of the things she was learning to read in this man she'd married. The summer was ending. The mountains had their first new snow high up, just a suggestion of what was coming, visible at dawn when the sky was clear. She looked at it every morning and took stock of what they had, what they needed, what the fall would require. The ranch was in better condition than it had been in October. Not prosperous yet, but viable. Moving toward something, she was too. And somewhere ahead, though she didn't know it yet, The thing that would test every skill she'd built and every reserve she'd accumulated was already gathering itself in the far weather systems of the north, turning slowly toward Montana the way all serious things turn, with patience, with inevitability, without the slightest awareness of or interest in anyone's plans. The second winter announced itself differently than the first. The first winter had been a stranger, brutal and incomprehensible, something Hazel had endured by gritting her teeth and reading everything she could find and refusing to show how frightened she was. This winter she felt coming in her body before it arrived, something in the way the light changed in October, flatter and more final than summer light, and the way the animals changed with it, eating more, moving less, settling into themselves with the practiced resignation of creatures that understood what was coming and had made their peace with it. She'd developed, without noticing the development, a kind of peripheral weather sense that had nothing to do with reading the sky and everything to do with having spent a full cycle of seasons in this particular piece of country. "It'll be worse than last year," she told Elias in the second week of November. He was at the table with the account book, which he consulted the way other men consulted almanacs, constantly, with a frown. "What makes you say that?" "The way it feels." She knew that sounded insufficient. "The birds left earlier. Kettle's been drinking more than usual for the past 3 weeks. The ground froze 2 weeks ahead of last year." She paused. "And last year was already bad." He looked up from the accounts. He had learned over the course of the year to take her observations seriously, even when they came without a scientific framework attached. She'd been right about the storm in January. She'd been right about the creek flooding its lower bank in spring when he'd thought they had another 2 weeks. She'd been right about the feed merchant. "How bad?" he said. "I don't know. Worse." She sat down across from him. "We need to talk about the North Pasture animals. I was going to move them in December." "I'd move them now." He looked at her. She looked back. He turned back to the accounts and wrote something in the margin that she couldn't read from across the table, and she understood this as his way of saying he was considering it, which was as close to immediate agreement as he generally came. He moved the North Pasture animals the following weekend. Cord thought this was excessive, and said so, because Cord said what he thought about operational matters without particular filter. Elias said they were moving them anyway. November passed. December came in cold and gray and stayed that way. The ranch ran on a winter rhythm that Hazel now knew by heart. The earlier rising, the abbreviated daylight, the way every task took longer in the cold, the particular kind of tired that accumulated differently than summer tired, deeper and less recoverable. She managed it. She was not happy in December the way she might have been happy somewhere warmer and easier, but she was not unhappy either. She was occupied, which had its own satisfactions. Kettle was pregnant again, which was expected and good news for the ranch's finances. Thorne, now 8 months old and still bad-tempered, had been moved to her own small paddock after demonstrating an enthusiasm for kicking other animals that Cord described as a character flaw and Hazel described as self-possession. The filly was growing into something that was genuinely impressive if you could get close enough to appreciate it, which most people couldn't. Hazel could. She'd made a project of Thorne the way she'd made a project of everything here. Patiently, methodically, without the expectation of immediate results. She spent time in the paddock, not trying to work the filly, just being there, present and calm and consistent. It took 3 weeks before Thorne stopped positioning herself at the far end of the paddock when Hazel came in. It took another 2 before the filly approached of her own accord to investigate her coat pockets for treats. It was the kind of progress that looked like nothing from the outside and felt like everything to the person who'd been patient enough to wait for it. "She let you touch her," Elias said one afternoon, watching from the fence. He hadn't announced himself. She'd heard him approach, but hadn't turned. "Yesterday," Hazel said, "along the neck. She didn't love it, but she allowed it. She tried to take a piece out of Cord's arm last week. Cord rushes. She doesn't like to be rushed." A pause. "Neither do you," Elias said, which was not something he'd said before. The kind of noticing he kept mostly internal, offered now without apparent forethought. She looked at him over the fence. He was looking at Thorne. "No," she agreed. "I don't." Christmas that year was quiet in the way that Christmas on a working ranch in Montana is always quiet. A pause in labor more than a celebration, though Hazel made the effort because effort was what she had, and it seemed important not to let the season pass entirely without acknowledgement. She'd managed a reasonable fruitcake from dried fruit she'd ordered in October for this specific purpose, and a small decorated branch from the pine stand near the East Creek because a full tree was more than the house could accommodate. Cord ate with them, as he had since the cold made the bunkhouse genuinely miserable, and the three of them sat around the table in the evening with the fire up and the wind doing its work outside, and it was fine. Better than fine, actually, in the way that simple things become better than they are when everything outside is trying to prevent them. Elias gave her a pair of work gloves, which she recognized as the most practical and therefore most sincere gift he could have given her. She'd given him a set of properly repaired account books. She'd recopied the last 2 years of records into clean ledgers, organized by month and category, with a summary page that showed the financial position at a glance. He sat and looked at those ledgers for a long time. "This took you 3 weeks of evenings," she said. "I wanted you to be able to see everything in one place." He turned pages. She watched his face move through the data, the losses, the recoveries, the places where the ranch's fortunes had shifted and why. "We're doing better," he said. "Than last year at this time?" "Yes, significantly. Because of a lot of things. The feed costs are down, the calving rate improved, the root cellar situation is better." She paused. "We work well together." He looked up at her. Something in his face was open in a way it wasn't always open. "We do," he said simply. It wasn't a declaration. She wasn't expecting declarations from Elias Crow, but it was real, and it was enough, and she held it the same way she held everything that mattered out here, carefully, without squeezing. Mason. The blizzard came in January, which was when serious blizzards came in that country, and it announced itself with none of the 4 to 6 day warnings of the previous year's storm. There was a single morning of dropping temperature and lowering sky, and then by noon the wind had arrived, and by nightfall it was not weather anymore. It was a state of being, an environment, a world of white noise and cold that erased everything else. Elias had been checking the fence line on the far side of the south pasture that morning, a routine inspection he'd mentioned at breakfast with the specificity of someone planning a short, unremarkable task. When noon passed and he wasn't back, Hazel didn't panic. She went to the barn and confirmed that his horse 7 was gone, and that Cord was there working, and that Cord also expected Elias back soon. By 2 o'clock, the storm was serious. By 3, it was genuinely bad. The kind of bad that made the barn feel like a different building than the barn she went to every morning. Louder and more urgent. The animals restless in the particular way animals are restless when the weather is doing something outside the range of what they've learned to accommodate. Cord came into the house at 3:30 with snow in his hair and a careful expression that told her he was managing what he was showing. "He probably sheltered somewhere," Cord said. "He knows this country. He's not going to ride in this." "I know," she said. She was already at the window, which showed her nothing but white. "If he got to the Renner homestead, he's fine. That's the closest shelter on the south route. Tom Renner would put him up, no question." "How far is the Renner homestead?" 2 miles, maybe 2.5. "And if he didn't make it that far?" Cord didn't answer immediately. "There's a rock outcrop at about the mile mark. He knows it. He'd go there." She turned from the window. "What would he need if he's at the outcrop?" "He's got his saddlebag. He always carries." "What would he need that he might not have?" Cord looked at her with the expression of a young man working out that a conversation is going somewhere he hadn't anticipated. "Heat, mainly. If 7's with him, he can use the horse for warmth. If 7 spooked and ran—" He stopped. "Then he needs someone to come to him," Hazel said. "You can't go out in this. You might not be able to wait it out. Mrs. Crow, how long does this type of storm typically last? Could be a night, could be 2 days. Last one of this—" He stopped again because he'd done the arithmetic and arrived at the same answer she had. A man alone at a rock outcrop in this cold, without shelter, for 2 days, the math of that was not difficult. She was already moving. She went to the coat hooks and took down her heaviest coat, the one she'd had made in November at her own specification, longer than the one she'd arrived in, with better closures and a layer inside she'd sewn herself from wool blanket material. She pulled on the riding pants she'd had the Delwood seamstress alter 3 times until they were right, and the heavy wool socks, and the boots with the extra thick soles she'd ordered from a catalog in September when she'd worked out that her original boots were inadequate. "You can't go alone," Cord said. He'd moved into the kitchen doorway. and I need to stay with the animals. Kettle's too close to foaling to leave unattended." "I know." She was winding the long wool scarf around her neck, up over her chin. "Saddle Dora for me." "The visibility is cord." She looked at him directly. "Saddle Dora." He went. She packed what she could carry. A blanket rolled tight, the matches in the waterproof tin she kept in the kitchen drawer, the flask she filled with the hot coffee that was still on the stove, the strips of dried beef from the pantry. She put them in the saddlebag with her hands that were already cold, even inside, and thought about each item as she packed it, what it would do, whether it was worth the wait. When she got to the barn, Cord had Dora saddled and was standing with her, holding the reins. "The south fence," he said. "Follow it. Don't leave the fence line. If you can't find the fence, stop and wait. You'll lose your direction in this and you'll walk in circles." He looked at her with something that was not quite fear but was adjacent to it. "You know the mile mark post where the fence jogs east?" "I know it. The outcrop is about 200 yards west of that post. There's a big flat rock that faces south. If he's there, that's where." "All right. If you're not back in 2 hours." "Give me 3, she said. The wind slows things down. He held Dora's bridle while she mounted. Not because she needed help, but because the gesture was his version of the thing he didn't know how to say. She settled into the saddle, gathered the reins, and felt the mare shift under her with the characteristic unease of a horse that knew the weather was wrong. "Steady," she said, to the mare and possibly to herself, and rode out into the white. The cold outside the barn was a different order of magnitude than anything she'd experienced. It was not painful, exactly, or not only painful. It was abrasive. It took the edges off things. She could feel it pressing against her face, the only exposed skin, working at the gap between scarf and hat brim, looking for purchase. She pulled the scarf higher and bent her head and focused on the fence. The fence was everything. As long as she could see the fence or touch it with her boot, she knew where she was and which direction she was going. She kept Dora close to it, close enough that occasionally a post loomed out of the white, and she had to adjust, and she moved at a walk because going faster meant losing the fence, and losing the fence meant losing everything. She could hear almost nothing over the wind. She couldn't see more than 15 or 20 feet in any direction. The world was white noise and cold, and the feeling of Dora moving underneath her, the one constant, the one thing she could feel clearly through all the layers and the cold and the wind. She talked to the mare. She didn't know she was doing it at first. She became aware of it after a few minutes, the steady low murmur of her own voice beneath the wind, saying nothing specific, just sound, the way she'd talked to Kettle through those long nighttime barn sessions. Whether it helped Dora, she couldn't tell. It helped her stay focused, kept her in her own body, which was important because the cold had a way of making you vague. Time became approximate. She counted fence posts and lost count and started again. She checked her sense of direction against the wind, which was coming consistently from the northwest, which meant as long as the wind was on her left, she was still going south along the east fence. The mile mark post came up on her left, taller than the others, and marked with an old tin that rattled and spun in the wind. She pulled Dora to a stop and oriented herself. 200 yards west. She looked west and saw nothing but white. "All right," she said to the mare, to herself. 200 yards. She left the fence. Those 200 yards were the longest of her life. Without the fence, she had nothing but the wind direction to navigate by, and the wind in a blizzard is not a reliable instrument. It eddied and shifted when it hit the contours of the land, and twice she stopped because she'd lost confidence in where west actually was, and she stood in the blowing white and made herself think clearly, which was harder than it should have been because the cold was doing something to her thinking, slowing it at the edges. Flat rock facing south. She was looking for a rock. She almost missed him because 7 was what she found first. The horse standing with his back to the wind and his head low, patient in the mute way that horses are patient when they have no better option. 7 was gray, and in the blizzard's white on white, he'd been almost invisible, and she pulled Dora up short when she saw him, and for a moment just sat there with the relief of it moving through her like something physical. Elias was behind the rock. He was sitting with his back against the south face of it, his coat pulled up around his ears, and he was conscious so that she could see him move as she rode up. But the way he was sitting, the careful stillness of someone conserving everything they have left, told her the timeline had been correct. He could not have waited 2 days. She got off Dora before the mare had fully stopped, which was not something she would have been capable of a year ago, and she came around the rock and crouched in front of him. Hazel. His voice was hoarse and slower than usual. I'm here. She was already working the flask out of the saddlebag. How long? Since noon, maybe before. Your hands. In my coat. I kept them inside. He pulled one out to show her. The color was not good. Not the white of frostbite, but the deep red of something that had been very cold for a long time. She wrapped both her hands around his. Can you feel them? Yes. He winced. Yes. That's good. She pressed the flask into his grip. Drink this. Carefully. Not too fast. He drank. She watched his face for the small signs of returning warmth. A slight change in color, a deepening of his breath. Then she stood and went to the horses. 7 was cold, but he'd had his own insulation, and horses ran warm. He'd kept Elias alive by proximity, standing close enough through the long afternoon that the shared heat had been enough margin. She checked the gelding with quick hands, found no damage she could identify, and tied his reins to Dora's saddle ring. Can you stand? She called back. Yes. A pause, and then the sounds of a man who was not as certain as he'd said, but was doing it anyway. He came around the rock with a hand on the flat face of it, moving carefully, and she went to his left side without asking and put his arm over her shoulders. 7 can carry you, she said. We'll go slow. I can ride. I know you can. I said slow. He looked at her. His face was windburned and his eyes were the particular alert but stripped look of someone who has spent hours alone in extreme cold, not broken but reduced to essentials. He looked at her for a long moment. How did you know where I was? He said. Cord told me the outcrop, and you always go to the thing that makes sense. She positioned him beside 7, and he mounted, badly, not his usual clean movement, and she got back on Dora and gathered 7's lead and turned them both east. The fence, she said. We follow it back. The return was harder because she was colder now, the reserves she'd had on the way out partially spent, and Elias on 7 needed watching. He was upright and moving, but he wasn't all the way back yet, and she kept checking him, kept talking, kept the chain of contact and consciousness that she'd learned was what mattered in the cold. Not warmth, not yet. Just keeping the person present and moving. She found the fence. She followed it north. The barn lights were visible from 50 yards, warm yellow through the white, and she'd never felt the relief of a destination so completely in her life. Cord heard them coming and had the barn door open before they arrived. The look on his face when he saw them both was the look of someone who had been preparing to go out himself and had not known what he was going to find. Get him inside, Hazel said, sliding off Dora. Her legs were not entirely reliable when she landed. She held the saddle for a moment. You all right? Cord said. Yes. Get him inside. I'll handle the horses. You can't, Cord. She let go of the saddle and her legs held. I'll handle the horses. Go. She handled the horses. She worked through it mechanically, with the single-minded focus of someone who knows that thinking about how they feel right now is a luxury to be deferred. The horses were cold and needed to be walked and dried and blanketed. And she did those things, and she checked on Kettle, who was restless with the storm's pressure but not in distress. And she stood in the barn for a few minutes after all of it was done with her forehead against Dora's warm neck, because she needed to stop moving and there wasn't room to do that inside yet. Her hands ached. Her hips were a sustained misery. Her face felt like it had been sandpapered. She stood there against the mare's neck and breathed. Then she went inside. Elias was at the kitchen table with Cord's blanket around him and his hands around a cup, and some of the color had come back into his face. He looked up when she came in. She was still in her coat, and she stood in the doorway, and they looked at each other for a moment with the particular clarity of people who have recently been in a situation where the possibility of not seeing each other again was not abstract. Sit down, he said. I need to check. Hazel. His voice was rough but firm. Sit down. She sat. He got up, moving slowly, with the careful deliberateness of a man whose body was still recalibrating, and poured her a cup of coffee and set it in front of her. And then he stood there for a moment with his hand on the back of her chair and she could feel the warmth of it even through her coat. "You shouldn't have come out in that," he said. His voice had something in it that wasn't quite what she expected. "I know," she said. "I could have waited it out." "Maybe." She wrapped both hands around the cup. But the math wasn't good. A long silence. Cord was in the corner doing something with his own hands that was clearly an excuse not to look at them. The stove ticked and settled. The wind outside was still working at the house, still looking for its way in, and the house was still holding. "You knew where to look," Elias said. "Cord told me." "Cord told you about the outcrop. You still had to find it." He moved back to his chair and sat. "In that." She looked at him. "You'd have done the same." "I know I would have." He looked down at his hands, turning the cup. "That's not what I'm saying." She waited. "I'm saying—" He stopped. Tried again. "I'm saying I know what it takes to do what you did, and I'm not sure I've said enough about what I—" Another stop. Elias Crow was a man who lived largely in action and had not spent a great deal of his adult life building the vocabulary for the other kind. She could see him working at it, the way she'd seen him work at anything that didn't come easy, with patience and a particular frown. "I'm glad you're here," he said, finally. "I'm glad you came." Hazel sat with that for a moment. Outside, the wind made its argument against the walls. The stove breathed its heat into the room. "I wasn't going to leave you out there," she said. It was the simplest true thing she could say. "I know." He looked at her. "I know that now." The blizzard lasted through the night and into the next morning, and then the wind died between 10 and noon, and the world went still and white and exhausted. Hazel slept for 4 hours in the afternoon, which she almost never did. Slept the deep, flat sleep of someone whose body had finally presented its invoice and required payment. When she woke, the house was quiet, and the light through the window was the low gold of late afternoon, and Elias was in the chair by the fire, reading one of her books. He'd borrowed it without asking, which she found she didn't mind. She lay still for a moment and looked at the ceiling. She thought about the 200 yards from the fence to the rock. About 7, standing in the white like a gray ghost. About Elias's hands, the wrong color, and the way he'd said her name when she came around the rock. Hazel, the way you say a word when you've been alone with it for a long time. She thought about October a year ago. The platform at Delwood Station, the two of them sizing each other up with careful eyes and calibrated expectations, and the mutual, unspoken understanding that neither of them had gotten what they'd bargained for. She thought about what they'd gotten instead. She got up. She went to the kitchen and looked at what needed doing for supper, which was the same practical question it always was, and she started on it, and after a while Elias came and stood in the kitchen doorway with her book still in his hand. "You were right," he said, "about the winter." "We both were," she said. "We both kept enough reserves." He looked at her. The look she'd never been able to fully catalog, that she'd been trying to read for a year now. She thought she was closer to understanding it than she had been in October. She thought it would probably take a while longer. "The south fence took some damage," he said eventually. "We'll need a week to repair it." "I can help." "I know you can," he said, and went back to the chair and her book. And the kitchen was warm, and outside the world was white and still, and the worst of it was done. But what came after the storm, what the community would make of it, what Ruth Plank would say, and what the ranch's people and enemies and neighbors would finally understand about the woman who had walked into that blizzard without hesitation. That was a reckoning of a different kind, and it was already coming. Word traveled the way word always traveled in Delwood, not through any single telling, but through the accumulation of tellings, each one slightly different from the last, the way a story picks up texture as it moves through a community until it arrives at the far end of town, wearing details it didn't have when it started. Cord told Tom Renner when he came to check that Elias had made it home safe. Tom Renner told his wife. His wife was at the dry goods store 2 days after the storm broke, when the roads were passable again, in the cautious way that roads are passable after a serious blizzard. Passable if you knew what you were doing and went slowly and didn't assume the ground was what it looked like. By the time the story reached the dry goods store, it had acquired some specifics that were accurate and some that weren't, but the core of it held. Hazel Crow had ridden into the worst blizzard of the decade, alone, to find her husband at a rock outcrop a mile from the south fence line, and had brought him home. Ruth Plank heard it at the dry goods store. She stood with her basket and listened to Tom Renner's wife tell it, and she didn't say anything until the telling was done, and then she said, "Which way did she come back? Along the fence or straight across?" Tom's wife didn't know. Ruth said, "Along the fence is the only way that makes sense in that visibility. If she came back along the fence, she knew what she was doing." She picked up her basket. "I'll go see them tomorrow." She came the next afternoon, Ruth Plank, driving her own small buggy with the competence of a woman who had been navigating Montana winters for 20 years and had no patience for being cautious about it. She knocked on the door of the Crow House, and Hazel answered, and Ruth stood on the porch with her coat still on and looked at Hazel with the direct, unsentimental assessment she gave everything. "You look like you had a hard week," Ruth said. "I did," Hazel said. "Can I come in?" Hazel stepped back from the door. Ruth came in, took off her coat without being asked where to put it, and hung it on the hook beside Elias's. She sat at the kitchen table and looked around the kitchen with the careful attention of someone who is reading a room the way other people read documents, taking inventory, drawing conclusions. "You've made changes in here," Ruth said. "Some." Hazel put the kettle on. "The organization wasn't working for the way we use the space." Ruth was looking at the window where the winter light came in and the remnants of last summer's seedling trays were still stacked neatly on the shelf. "Clara Hess says you reorganized the water rights meeting in March. I made a suggestion. She says you solved a problem that had been going around the same track for 2 years. Ruth accepted the cup Hazel set in front of her. "I heard different things about you before I'd met you. After I met you, I formed my own opinion, which was that you were tougher than you looked, but that the jury was still out." She wrapped both hands around the cup. "The jury's in." Hazel sat across from her. "What did they decide?" "That you're what this country needs more of and gets less of than it should." Ruth said it plainly, without warmth, but also without distance, the way she apparently said anything she'd thought carefully about. "I was hard on you when you arrived." "You were honest," Hazel said. "I'd rather have honesty." "Most people say that. Most people mean they'd rather have honest praise." Ruth looked at her. "You actually meant it. I've never found it useful to want things to be different than they are," Hazel said. "It wastes time you could spend on the actual problem." Ruth was quiet for a moment, drinking her tea. "Elias is all right. He's mending a fence line. He was all right 2 days after we got back." She paused. "He's a resilient man." "He's a stubborn man," Ruth said. "Resilient is what you call stubborn when it works out." She set her cup down. "My first husband was the same way. Went out in weather he shouldn't have gone out in and didn't come back. That was 1871. She said it without self-pity, as simple fact. "You were smarter than I was. You went after him." The kitchen was quiet. Outside they could hear the distant sound of cord working somewhere on the north side of the barn, the rhythmic sound of something being hammered. "I didn't have a choice," Hazel said. "That's the honest answer. It wasn't courage. I just couldn't sit here and wait." "That's what courage usually is," Ruth said, "not being able to live with the alternative." She stood and got her coat. "I'm going to the auxiliary meeting next week. I'd like you to run the minutes again." "All right," Hazel said. "And I'm going to tell people what I think about you now," Ruth said at the door, "which is what I should have done 6 months ago instead of what I did do. I can't undo that." "No," Hazel agreed, "but you can start from where we are." Ruth looked at her for a moment. Something in the older woman's face shifted slightly. The smallest possible opening, the kind that decades of self-sufficiency and loss had made her careful with. "Yes," she said, "I suppose I can." And she left. 7. Elias came in for lunch and found Hazel at the table with a letter she'd been composing, which she set down when he came in. He looked at the letter and then at her. "Ruth Plank's buggy," he said. "She came by. How was that?" "Better than I expected." Hazel got up and went to the stove. She apologized. In Ruth Plank terms, which means she told me what she should have said sooner rather than directly saying she was sorry, but the substance was there. He sat down. He was still moving with the careful quality of a man whose body remembered what it had been through, though he was mostly recovered and would not have acknowledged that he wasn't. "What did she want?" To see that I was real, Hazel said. Same as always. That's all she ever wanted. She brought the soup and set it down and sat across from him. People are going to talk about the blizzard for a while. Already are. He picked up the spoon. Tom Renner stopped me this morning when I was getting wire at the hardware. Wanted to know if the story was true. What did you tell him? I told him it was. He looked at the soup. I told him you'd probably done it better than he'd heard it. She felt something warm in her chest at that, unexpected and specific. You didn't have to say that. It's true. He ate. After a while, he said without looking up, the story going around has some things in it that aren't right. Like what? Some version has you finding me unconscious. You were conscious. I know I was conscious. I was cold and I'd been there for hours and my hands were bad, but I was conscious. He looked up. I want to make sure that's the version you're telling. She looked at him steadily. Why does it matter? Because what you did was hard enough without people thinking it was more dramatic than it was. You didn't rescue a dying man. You found a man who was in a bad spot and you helped him get out of it. He paused. That's what happened. That's what happened, she agreed. I don't want it made into something it wasn't. She thought about what it had actually been. The 200 yards without the fence, the cold pressing at the edges of her thinking, Seven standing like a gray ghost in the white, and Elias behind the rock with his hands the wrong color, saying her name. She thought about the mathematics of how long he could have waited and whether the answer was 2 days or something considerably less. All right, she said, I'll tell it straight. He nodded and went back to eating, and the version of it he'd described was true as far as it went. She kept the rest of it in herself, where it didn't need to go. February moved through, and March came with its mud and its promises, and the community around Delwood rearranged itself slightly. The way communities do when new information requires an adjustment, when someone they'd filed in one category turns out to belong in another. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't the way it happened in stories where a single event turns opinion like a tide. It was smaller than that and more real. A gradual shift in the way people looked at her when she came into town, the way conversations included her that hadn't included her before, the way certain women who'd been politely distant were now something closer to present. Clara Hess had always been on her side, but Clara Hess's warmth had a different quality now. Less the warmth of someone championing an underdog, and more the warmth of someone who'd been proven right and was modestly pleased about it. Addie Graves, the woman who'd suggested pulling the county survey at the water rights meeting, started saving Hazel a seat at the auxiliary gatherings without being asked. And people stopped commenting on her appearance, at least to her face. She was under no illusion that they'd stopped entirely. She knew how people were, and she'd never expected Delwood to be different. But the open assessments, the frank sizing up that had followed her through that first year like a second shadow, went quiet. She'd become too specific a person for the general judgment to stick. She noticed this without making much of it. She'd spent enough energy in her first year simply surviving the place to have much left over for tracking its social weather. But she noticed. Kettle fold in late February, a week earlier than the revised calculations, in the middle of the night in the barn while Hazel was on her check. She came in to find the mare in the early stages and spent the next 3 hours sitting with her in the lamplight, monitoring, ready, talking in the low, steady voice that seemed to work on Kettle the way it had worked on Thorn. The foal arrived without complication, a colt, dark like his mother and considerably more cooperative in temperament than his older sister. Hazel was alone for it, Elias asleep in the house, and she managed the immediate necessities with the competence of someone who had studied the process carefully and watched it happen twice before and understood what needed to be done and in what order. When it was over, when the colt was on his feet and Kettle was settled and everything was as it should be, she sat on the hay bale and looked at the two of them in the lamp's circle of light and felt the exhaustion and the satisfaction of it simultaneously, the particular satisfaction of a thing done correctly at the right time. She went back to the house at 4 a.m. and stood in the bedroom doorway. Kettle foaled, she said. Healthy colt, both fine. Elias came awake fast, the way he always did. You managed it alone? It wasn't complicated. She did most of the work. He sat on the edge of the bed with his hands on his knees, and she could see him working through the relief of it. A healthy foal was money. More than that, it was momentum, the sense that the ranch was building rather than holding. Good, he said. That's good. He looked at her, standing in the doorway with hay in her hair and her coat still on. Come to bed. I need to Whatever it is can wait an hour, he said. Come to bed. She came to bed. She was asleep in under 2 minutes, which was faster than she'd ever fallen asleep in her life. And she didn't dream, and when she woke the light was full, and Elias had already gone out to see the colt. She named him Compass, which Elias didn't object to at all. Spring that year had a different quality than the spring before. Not easier. The work was the same, the mud and the calving and the compressed urgency of everything coming due simultaneously. But she moved through it with a fluency she hadn't had at this time last year, a knowledge of the rhythm and the requirements that lived in her body now, rather than in the books she'd read. She still referenced the books. She still asked questions when she didn't know something. But the baseline of what she knew had shifted substantially, and with it the baseline of what she could handle before she needed to ask. The calving season that spring produced 11 healthy calves from 13 pregnancies, a rate that Elias said was better than any year since he'd been running cattle on this land. He said it at dinner one evening, without looking up from the accounts, the way he tended to say significant things. And she absorbed it the same way, without making a ceremony of it. The early move from the north pasture helped, she said. They were in better condition going into winter. The hay situation helped, he said, which was her hay situation. The organization she'd implemented in the root cellar and the storage adjustments she'd made that first fall. Both things, she said. Both things, he agreed. The account book showed something she'd been tracking since January. The shape of a ranch that was, for the first time since Elias had bought the land, not simply surviving but accumulating. Small amounts, cautious amounts, but real. She showed him the summary page she'd prepared. He sat with it and read it slowly, which he always did with things she'd calculated, not because he doubted her, but because he took numbers seriously. We could extend the south pasture fence, he said, in the fall, run more cattle next year. If we repair the well situation first, she said, the secondary well's unreliable. If we're running more animals, we need reliable water. The well's going to cost, I know what it's going to cost. I've already gotten 2 estimates. She slid a piece of paper across the table. Harwick's is better. He uses better casing. He looked at the estimates. He looked at her. She waited. Harwick it is, he said. The summer brought Cord to her one morning with an expression she'd learned to associate with him, having something to say that he wasn't sure how to say. He was 24 now, a year older and somewhat less blunt than when she'd arrived, though the improvement was a matter of degree. There's a woman at the Graves place, he said. Addie Graves's niece. She came out from Ohio in the spring, and she's... He stopped. She's not doing well. What kind of not doing well? She can't... He pulled his hat off and turned it in his hands, which was his tell. She can't figure out the stove. She's burned everything she's cooked. She's afraid of the animals. The Graves family's been patient, but she's been there 3 months and she's not improving, and I think... He stopped again. You think she needs someone to teach her? Hazel said. I think she needs someone who understands what it's like to not know how any of this works. He said it carefully, with the specific delicacy of a young man who understood he was navigating something. When you first came, you didn't know how any of it worked either, but you figured it out. She thought about October. The stove, the iron, the horses, Cord's face when Elias introduced her. The way the cold that first winter had felt like an argument she was losing every single day. What's her name? Hazel asked. Nora. Nora Fitch. Tell Addie Graves I'll come by Wednesday, she said. Nora Fitch was 22 and small-boned and had the look of someone who had been told a great many times in the last 3 months that she wasn't suited for this life and had started to believe it. She met Hazel at the Graves' kitchen door with the guarded expression of a person who expects to be assessed and found wanting. Mrs. Crow, she said. Hazel, Hazel said. Can I see the stove? The stove was a problem she recognized. Not the stove itself, but the relationship between the person and the stove. The particular tension of someone who had been burned and was now approaching the thing with too much caution and too little confidence, which made everything harder than it needed to be. She spent the morning at the Graves kitchen showing Nora things. Not lecturing. She'd never liked being lectured and didn't do it to others, but demonstrating and talking through what she was doing and why, and asking Nora questions rather than assuming what she didn't know. Nora was smart. That was apparent within the first hour. She'd been told she wasn't suited to this life, but what she actually wasn't suited to was being thrown into it without a framework. She needed the why behind the what, and no one had given her any whys. They'd just shown her what to do and expected her to replicate it through some mechanism she hadn't been provided with. "Why does it draft differently in cold weather?" Nora asked after Hazel had explained the vent adjustment. "The cold air outside is denser," Hazel said. "The draw changes because the pressure differential, the difference between inside and outside air, changes. You compensate by opening the side vent to add more draw." Nora looked at the stove with a different expression than she'd had before. "That makes sense," she said. Most of it makes sense when someone explains the underlying reason," Hazel said. "I learned everything out here by finding the underlying reason. Once you understand why it works, you can figure out what to do when it stops working the way it should." She went back 3 more times over the next month. She brought one of her books, the practical homesteading guide she'd worked through in her first winter, and lent it to Nora with specific sections marked. She brought Nora to the Crow Ranch once and showed her the garden and the root cellar organization and the way the barn was laid out, and she answered every question Nora asked without making her feel that any question was unreasonable. Addie Graves came to find her after the 3rd visit, catching her as she was getting back on Dora. "I don't know what you said to her," Addie said, "but she made a loaf of bread last Tuesday that was actually bread." "She's not the problem," Hazel said. "She never was. She just needed someone to explain what she was actually dealing with." Addie looked at her for a moment. "You know there are 3 other women like her in the valley. Come out from back east, no preparation, no one with the patience to—" "I know," Hazel said. "Would you—" "Tell them to come by on the 1st Saturday of the month," Hazel said. "I'll be there." The first Saturday gathering happened in August. 4 women at the Crow kitchen table. Nora Fitch and 2 others who'd come from the eastern states, and one who'd come from a Texas city and found Montana's winters a different proposition than she'd anticipated. They sat around the table that had been Hazel's first mystery and her first territory, the cast iron stove producing coffee behind them, and she talked with them the way she would have wanted someone to talk with her in October of the previous year, directly, practically, without condescension and without false reassurance. Elias came in mid-morning for something and found 4 women he didn't know at his kitchen table and Hazel at the stove, and he stood in the doorway for a moment with an expression that resolved from surprise to something quieter. "I'll eat at the barn," he said, and went back out. She heard him say it and felt something move in her chest, the particular warmth of a man who understands what matters and gets out of the way of it. Yet, that fall, the fence extension happened, and the well repairs happened, and 2 more breeding mares joined the ranch's stock from a sale in Billings that Hazel had identified in the trading circular 3 months earlier and flagged for Elias with a detailed note on why those specific animals and why that price represented good value. He'd gone and looked at them and come back saying she was right, and they'd bought them, and she'd taken no particular pleasure in being right beyond the practical satisfaction of the decision being correct. The feed merchant situation resolved that fall, or rather, Elias resolved it, in a meeting at the merchant's store that Hazel didn't attend and didn't ask about the details of afterward. What she knew was that the charges were corrected going forward, that some amount of back overcharge was acknowledged and settled, and that the merchant now looked at her, on the infrequent occasions they were in the same room, with the careful attention of a man who understood that she was paying close attention to his numbers. She was fine with that. The auxiliary meeting in September had 15 women instead of 11, and Hazel was running the minutes and had been asked, by Ruth Plank directly, to take on the organization of the following spring's collective supply order, a coordination effort that had historically been chaotic and expensive because no one had sat down and worked out the logic of pooling purchases for better rates. "You want me to run it?" Hazel said when Ruth proposed it. "I want you to fix it," Ruth said. "Running it is whatever you call what you do." "That's a considerable amount of work." "Yes," Ruth said. "You're the person who can do it." It was the most direct thing Ruth had ever said to her. Hazel looked at the older woman. The 20 years of Montana in her face, the loss and the survival, the closed places that sometimes opened marginally and then closed again, and felt a respect for her that had been building since the morning Ruth had appeared on the porch and said she was wrong. "All right," Hazel said. But one evening in October, 2 years to the month from her arrival at Delwood Station, Hazel sat at the kitchen table after Elias had gone out to check the animals, and she looked at the room around her. The stove she now operated without thinking. The shelves organized the way she'd decided they made sense. The window with the winter seedling set up waiting for February. The account books in their row on the shelf, clean and current. She thought about this woman who'd stood in this kitchen in October of 1887 and looked at the cast-iron stove like it was a problem she wasn't sure she could solve. She felt something for that woman. Not pity, exactly, but a kind of tenderness. The way you feel about a version of yourself that did something hard without knowing it was hard. Elias came back in and sat across from her and put his hands on the table. And they were the hands of a man who worked outside all his life, scarred and rough and capable. And she knew them now, the way she knew the stove and the fence line and the shape of the mountains at dusk. "Something on your mind?" he said. "I was thinking about when I arrived." 2 years ago. 2 years ago, she said. "We were both expecting something different." He was quiet for a moment, considering. "I got something better than I expected," he said. He said it the way he said most significant things, without ornament, without apparent awareness that it was significant. And she knew by now that this was not carelessness. It was how he meant things, fully and simply, without dressing them up. She looked at him across the table. The lamp was between them and the light fell across his face. And outside the October wind was doing preliminary work on the winter ahead. And the horses were in, and the accounts were in good order, and the ranch was more than they'd had 2 years ago. "So did I," she said. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, just briefly, just for a moment, the way he did things, without announcement. And then he pulled the account book toward him and opened it to the current month and began to read. And she went back to what she'd been doing, and the kitchen was warm, and the wind worked at the house, and nothing was perfect, and everything was theirs. The winter that followed was hard but manageable, which had become their standard, not easy, not catastrophic, the ongoing negotiation between what this country demanded and what they'd built to meet it. The Saturday gatherings continued through the cold months, smaller in winter but present. The Crow Kitchen becoming something it hadn't been built to be, which was a place where women who needed to learn things came to learn them from someone who remembered exactly what it was like not to know. Nora Fitch got through her second winter without significant crisis, and wrote Hazel a letter about it that was 3 pages long and specific in its gratitude in the way that real gratitude is specific, naming exact things. Hazel read it twice and kept it. And through the winter and into the spring of their 3rd year, the ranch continued its slow, unglamorous expansion. The work of people who understood that nothing out here was built fast or maintained easily, who'd stopped expecting ease and started expecting challenge, and had discovered that this, counterintuitively, made them less brittle and not more. People in Delwood had stopped saying much about Hazel Crow's appearance. Not because they'd forgotten it. People don't forget things like that. They just find them less relevant when other more interesting information is available. What was more interesting by the 3rd year was what she'd done and what she was doing and what she'd turned that struggling ranch into alongside the man who'd ordered a mail-order bride from Boston and gotten something else entirely. What he'd gotten was a partner, fully and practically and in every sense of the word. Someone who looked at problems the way he did, as things that had solutions if you were willing to do the work of finding them, and who brought knowledge and capabilities different from his own in ways that didn't threaten but extended. Someone who had walked into a blizzard to find him and hadn't made a dramatic story of it afterward. He thought about that sometimes, about the mile of fence line in the white and the 200 yards beyond it, and the way she'd come around that rock with the cold in her face and the flask already out of her bag, practical and present and completely there. He'd known, he thought, somewhere around that moment. Not that he loved her. He'd known that longer than he'd acknowledged it. But that she was, in some way he couldn't have articulated in October of 1887 when he'd watched her climb down from the wagon bench with a bag in each hand, exactly what this place needed. Exactly what he needed. Not despite the things that had been wrong about the arrangement and the setting and the expectations, because of them. because she'd shown up anyway and stayed anyway and learned everything she'd needed to learn without ever asking this country to be kinder than it was. He told her once, which was more than he was used to saying things like this, that he thought she was the most capable person he'd ever met. She'd looked at him for a moment, and something crossed her face that wasn't modesty and wasn't pride, but was something between them. A private, complicated satisfaction, the look of someone for whom that sentence landed in a very specific place. I had good material to work with, she said, and went back to what she was doing, and he understood that she meant the land and the work, and probably him, and she wasn't going to say any of that directly, which was all right because he understood her well enough by now to know what she meant when she said what she said. It was enough. It was, in the accounting of what they'd built together from what they'd started with, considerably more than enough. The fourth spring was when the trouble came. It arrived the way serious trouble tends to arrive in small communities, not loudly, not all at once, but in pieces, each piece seeming manageable until you looked at the whole of it and understood what you were actually dealing with. It started with a letter, then a meeting, then a name that began appearing in conversations with the particular frequency of something that was going to matter whether you wanted it to or not. The name was Harlan Geddes. He was a land speculator from Helena, the kind of man who existed in the territory in increasing numbers in those years, men who had identified that the frontier was closing and that the closing of it created opportunities for those who understood how to work paper and pressure better than they worked land. Geddes had acquired, through methods that were technically legal but practically predatory, a significant portion of the water rights on the main creek that fed the southern valley, including the creek that ran through 3 properties adjacent to the Crow land. He didn't want the water. He wanted leverage. The water rights were a tool to force small ranchers into selling land at below market prices, because land without reliable water was not land anyone could run cattle on, and everyone in the valley knew it. The letter arrived in April, addressed to Elias, formal in the way that letters from lawyers are formal. Precise language designed to sound like information while actually functioning as threat. It outlined Geddes's ownership of the water rights, cited the specific legal instruments by which he held them, and proposed a meeting to discuss future arrangements, which was the language of a man who had already decided what the arrangements would be and was offering the appearance of negotiation as a courtesy. Elias read it at the kitchen table, and his face went through several things in sequence: confusion, understanding, anger, and then the particular stillness that in Elias meant he was thinking hard and wasn't ready to talk yet. Hazel read it after him. She read it twice. "He's done this before," she said. "Probably. The language is too clean. Someone wrote this who has written letters like it before." She set it down. "He's already done this somewhere else in the territory, and it worked." "How do you know that?" "Because if it hadn't worked, he'd have tried a different approach." She looked at the letter. "He knows exactly what he's doing." Elias was quiet. "If he controls the creek water, we can't run the south pasture. We can't run 2/3 of what we have." "I know. We'd have to sell, or pay whatever he asks for access, which is the same thing over time." She stood and went to the window. The south pasture was visible from it, the spring grass coming in, green and serious, the fences they'd repaired and extended over 3 years of steady work. "Who else got this letter?" "I don't know yet." "Find out today," she said. "Before he starts meeting with people individually. Once he starts talking to people separately, he can play them against each other." He looked at her. "You're already thinking about how to fight it." "Aren't you?" "Yes," he said. "But you're 3 steps ahead of me." "I've been reading about water rights law since March," she said. He stared at her. The creek situation came up at the auxiliary meeting in February. Not this specifically, but the general vulnerability. "I looked into the legal framework afterward. I thought it was worth understanding." She turned from the window. "There are grounds to challenge consolidated water rights acquisition under territorial law if it can be demonstrated that the acquisition was designed to damage existing agricultural operations. It's not a simple argument, but it exists." Elias was quiet for a long moment. "You read law." "I read what I need to read." She sat back down. "We need Tom Renner and the Hess farm and the 2 properties on the South Fork. If we're going to fight this, we fight it together, or we don't fight it at all." She went to see Ruth Plank that afternoon because Ruth Plank knew everything about everyone in the valley and had opinions about all of it, and was, when she chose to be, a woman of considerable practical influence. Ruth was in her kitchen when Hazel arrived, and she read the letter Hazel had brought a copy of, and her expression moved through something similar to Elias's: understanding, anger, and then a cold, calculating stillness. "Harlan Geddes," Ruth said. "I've heard this name. From where?" "A woman I correspond with in the Judith Basin. He did something similar there 2 years ago. 3 families sold. 1 held out, and he made their life miserable for 18 months, and then they sold too." Ruth set the letter down. "He won. He won there because they were isolated," Hazel said. "They didn't act together." Ruth looked at her. "You want to organize the valley?" "I want to make a case that is too expensive and too complicated for him to pursue. A speculator works on margin. He needs the cost of acquisition to stay below the value of what he acquires. If we make the legal challenge expensive enough and uncertain enough, the math stops working for him." She paused. "But it only works if everyone holds. If one person sells or settles separately, he gets the foothold he needs." "Tom Renner will hold," Ruth said without hesitation. "The Hess family will hold. The South Fork properties." She paused. "Caleb Morton is the question. He's had 2 bad years and he's tired, and Geddes will go to him first because Geddes will know he's the weakest link. Then we need to go to Caleb Morton before Geddes does." Ruth looked at her with the expression she'd had on that porch 2 years ago. The recalibration, the revised estimate. But there was something different in it now. Not surprised, just a kind of steady recognition. "You know," Ruth said, "when you got off that train in October of '87, I told Margaret Hess that you'd be gone before spring." "I know," Hazel said. "Clara told me. I was wrong about you from the first day." Ruth said it plainly, the way she said everything that cost her something. "I want you to know I understand that." "You were working from available information," Hazel said, the same thing she'd told Cord 3 years ago, which remained true and remained sufficient. "We've both updated since then." Ruth almost smiled. It was a small thing, a fractional shift, but Hazel had learned to see it. "Let's go talk to Caleb Morton," Ruth said, and got her coat. They went together, which mattered. Ruth Plank's presence at a conversation in the Delwood Valley was not neutral. It signaled something about the seriousness of the matter and the quality of the people involved. And Caleb Morton, a lean, sun-damaged man of 50, who had the permanent expression of someone calculating whether the next year would be better than the last, received them with the wariness of a man who suspected he was about to be asked to do something difficult. The kitchen of the Morton place was colder than it should have been for April. A wood situation, Hazel noted, that was probably part of the 2 bad years. She sat across from Caleb and his wife Dora, a quiet woman who had said 3 words since they arrived, and whose silence had the quality of someone who listens carefully. "He hasn't contacted you yet," Hazel said. It wasn't a question. "Not yet," Caleb said, "but I heard he's coming to the valley. He'll come to you first, and he'll offer you something that looks like a reasonable price for a bad situation. It won't be reasonable. It'll be below market, and the market is already low because he's created the conditions that lowered it." She was direct about it because Caleb Morton didn't look like a man who had energy for indirection. "If you sell, he has what he needs, and everyone else in the valley loses their negotiating position." Caleb's jaw tightened. "I've had 2 bad years." "I know." She looked at him steadily. "So has everyone in this valley. Last winter was hard for all of us." "Not for everyone equally," he said, and there was something in it, not accusation exactly, but a kind of rawness. He'd heard about the Crow Ranch's improvement. It was probably not entirely comfortable information. "No," she said, "not equally. We had some advantages." She didn't list them. He didn't need a list of her advantages. "But what Geddes is doing targets the whole valley, not the weakest parts of it. If he gets the creek water, the Crow Ranch loses its south pasture too. We're not asking you to protect us. We're asking you to protect yourself, alongside us." A long silence. Dora Morton was looking at Hazel with the careful attention she'd had since they arrived. "What would it cost?" Caleb said. "A legal fight. The collective cost is manageable if it's divided across all the properties involved. I've looked at the numbers." She had. She'd been at the account books until midnight for 3 nights. I can show you the breakdown. You figured the cost. Yes. He looked at Ruth Plank. This is her idea. It's a good idea, Ruth said. That's the relevant point. Another silence. Then Dora Morton, who had said 3 words since they'd arrived, said, Caleb, listen to her. Caleb Morton looked at his wife. Something passed between them. The compressed communication of 2 people who have been through difficulty together and know how to read each other in the shorthand of shared history. All right, he said. I'm listening. The meeting happened at the Renner homestead in the 2nd week of April. 11 people from 7 properties sitting in Tom Renner's front room, which was not built for that number and made no pretense of being comfortable about it. Elias was there. Ruth was there. Clara and her husband, the Mortons. 2 families from the South Fork that Hazel had visited specifically in the week before the meeting, making the case in each kitchen the way she'd made it in the Morton kitchen, directly, with the numbers available, without pretending the situation was easier than it was. Hazel ran the meeting. This had not been formally decided. It simply happened, the way things happen when one person in a room has done the most preparation and the others can see it. She went through the legal situation without simplifying it into falseness, which meant acknowledging the parts that were uncertain and the parts that were unfavorable as clearly as the parts that gave them ground to stand on. We can challenge the acquisition, she said. The territorial law has a provision that Geddes probably didn't account for because it's been used rarely. It was written for a different situation, but it applies here. If we can demonstrate that the water rights consolidation was executed with the intent to damage existing agricultural operations rather than for the purposes of legitimate water use, the acquisition can be contested. Can we prove that? Tom Renner asked. We can build a case that makes it expensive for him not to settle. He's a speculator. He's working at scale. He has multiple operations like this running simultaneously. A prolonged legal fight in one territory costs him time and money and attention he needs elsewhere. If we make this difficult enough, the calculation changes. And if he decides to fight it out anyway, the older of the 2 South Fork men said. His name was Aldous Crane, and he had the skepticism of someone who had been in the territory long enough to have seen several good plans fail. Then we fight it out, Hazel said. And we have a real argument and real numbers and the territorial law on our side, which is more than the Judith Basin families had. She looked around the room. I'm not telling you this is certain. I'm telling you it's a better option than selling individually, which is no option at all. The room was quiet. She'd given them the honest version, and now they had to decide what to do with it. It was Ruth who spoke first. From her chair in the corner where she'd been sitting with the stillness of a woman conserving judgment for the moment it was needed. I've been in this valley for 22 years, she said. I've seen men come in and take things from people who didn't know how to hold on to them. This is the same thing in different clothes. She looked at the room. I'm holding. Anyone who wants to can make their own decision, but that's mine. Elias said, We're holding. Tom Renner said, Same. It went around the room. Caleb Morton was second to last, and there was a pause before he said it. The pause of a tired man making a difficult decision that he wasn't certain he had the resources for. But he said it. We're holding. Harlan Geddes arrived in Delwood 3 weeks later, and the community he found was not the one he'd prepared for. He was a compact, well-dressed man who carried the confidence of someone accustomed to controlling the terms of his interactions, and the first indication that this situation was different was when his meeting request to Elias Crow produced not a one-on-one negotiation, but a formal written response, polite, precise, and clearly composed by someone who understood the legal framework of the dispute, that indicated the affected properties would be represented collectively, and that any discussion of the water rights would need to include their legal position. He asked around about the Crow Ranch. He heard about Hazel. He heard about the blizzard and the letter to the auxiliary and the Saturday gatherings and the meeting at the Renner place and the fact that 7 properties in the Southern Valley had coordinated their response to his acquisition before he'd had a single individual conversation. He sat in his hotel room in Delwood and looked at the response letter for a long time. The legal challenge was filed in June. It was not fast. Nothing legal was fast. And the summer and fall were spent in the uncomfortable in-between of a dispute that was unresolved, with all the uncertainty that entailed for the ranch's planning. Hazel managed this the way she managed everything. by keeping the things she could control controlled and accepting the uncertainty of what she couldn't without letting it become paralysis. She corresponded with the lawyer in Helena who had handled water rights cases before, a meticulous woman named Cecilia Park who charged a fair rate and communicated clearly, both of which Hazel appreciated. She organized the collective document preparation across the 7 properties, which was a substantial administrative effort that required tracking down deed records and survey documents and land transfer histories for properties whose owners had not always kept their paperwork in order. Caleb Morton's records were a specific challenge. He'd kept them in a coffee tin in the back of a cabinet, and they were complete but completely disorganized. And she spent 2 afternoons at his kitchen table with Dora Morton going through them and putting them into an order that meant something. "You didn't have to come out here yourself," Dora said on the second afternoon. "It was easier than explaining how to do it," Hazel said, which was true and also wasn't entirely the reason. Dora looked at her with the steady attention she'd had at the first meeting. "You know when you came to see us in April? I told Caleb to listen to you, and he did, and I want you to know why." Hazel looked up from the papers. "Because you didn't try to make it sound easier than it was," Dora said. "Everyone who'd come to talk to us about the Gettys situation before you, the county man who came around, the other ranchers, they were trying to reassure us. You weren't reassuring us. You were telling us the truth and asking us to decide." She was quiet a moment. "I've been waiting for someone to tell us the truth about our situation for 2 years. Hazel held that. "I know what it's like to be told a comforting version of something that isn't true," she said. "I got a comforting version of this ranch when I arrived. It wasn't useful." She went back to the papers. "The truth is harder, but it's the only thing you can actually work with." Gettys settled in November, not entirely on their terms. Nothing in that kind of negotiation resolved entirely on anyone's terms, but substantially. He retained nominal ownership of the water rights he'd acquired, but agreed to usage terms that guaranteed the affected properties access at defined rates for a period of 30 years, with specific protections against rate increases beyond a set ceiling. Cecilia Park called it a stronger outcome than she'd expected, and said so in the letter, which was the closest she came to enthusiasm. Hazel read the settlement letter at the kitchen table on a November morning, with the early winter light coming through the window and the stove already going, and Elias across from her with his coffee, and she read it through twice and then set it down. 30 years, she said. "That covers us," Elias said. "It covers Caleb Morton, too, and the South Fork properties. 30 years is most of their working lives." She thought about Dora Morton's face when she'd said, "The truth is the only thing you can actually work with." She thought about Caleb Morton saying, "All right, I'm listening." "It was worth doing," she said. "It was worth doing," Elias agreed. He reached over and put his hand over hers on the table. The same gesture as 2 years before. The same brevity. The same complete sincerity. She turned her hand over under his and held it, which was something she hadn't done the first time. They sat like that for a while, and outside the world was going about the serious business of becoming winter again, and neither of them needed to say anything more about it. Time moved the way time moves when people are too busy to track it carefully. In seasons more than years, in the particular textures of springs and falls, in the accumulation of things that happened and were absorbed and became part of the fabric of what they were. Thorne was trained by the time she was 4, which took longer than it would have with an easier animal, and produced something that was worth the extra time, a mare with a quality of movement that made experienced horsemen stop and look, and a temperament that was demanding but not unmanageable, and a particular bond with Hazel that had developed from those early paddock sessions and never fully transferred to anyone else. Elias could ride her, Cord could manage her, but she was Hazel's horse in the way that some animals are specifically one person's, and everyone who dealt with her understood this without it needing to be said. Compass grew into a gelding of quiet intelligence, who became Elias's primary working horse, and who, against all expectations given his mother's temperament, was the most cooperative animal on the ranch. Cord said this proved nothing because the most agreeable children often came from the most difficult parents. Hazel thought this was probably correct. The Saturday gatherings continued and grew. By the 6th year, they had outgrown the Crow kitchen and moved to the Renner barn on Saturdays that were too cold for anything else, and the women who came were no longer only newcomers learning basic survival. They were also established women who came for the exchange of practical knowledge that Hazel had made the gathering's actual purpose. Seed varieties, preservation techniques, animal husbandry, the legal basics of property rights that Hazel had learned through necessity and had decided other women in the valley should not have to learn the hard way. The water rights case had clarified for her, more precisely than anything before, that ignorance of legal frameworks was not modesty. It was vulnerability. She wrote it down. Not formally, not as a guide or a manual, but as notes, the kind of notes she'd always kept for herself, working through problems on paper because paper was where her thinking became clear. Over the course of 2 years, these notes accumulated into something substantial, and Cecilia Park, the Helena lawyer, came to visit one spring and read through them and said that with some organization, they would be of genuine use to women across the territory. "You should send them somewhere," Cecilia said. "A women's organization in Helena would publish this, or the agricultural cooperative." "I'm not a writer," Hazel said. "You're a writer who doesn't call herself one," Cecilia said, with the directness of a woman who had no patience for false modesty and could distinguish it from real modesty. "These are clear and specific and practical, and they come from actual experience, which is more than most published material on frontier homesteading can claim." The notes were organized over the following winter, Hazel working at the table in the evenings with the lamp turned up, and sent to a women's cooperative in Helena in the spring of the 8th year. They were published in a series of short guides that year and the year following under her name, which she had insisted on against the cooperative's initial suggestion of anonymity. If it was worth publishing, it was worth owning, she'd said. Cecilia had agreed. Elias's hands started giving him trouble in the 9th year, an arthritis that came in winter and made the cold weather work harder than it had been. A physical limitation that he acknowledged with the same minimizing stoicism he gave most difficult things. She watched him adapt without saying much about it, which was the right approach because he didn't want much said. He found new ways of doing things that hurt less. He accepted Cord's help in areas where he'd previously managed alone. He did not complain and he did not stop, and she loved him for both of those things while also watching for the signs that he was pushing past what was reasonable, which she had to watch for because he would not watch for it himself. They had arguments. Real ones. The kind that come from two people who know each other well enough to find the exact places where their thinking is genuinely different. About the ranch's expansion pace, he was cautious in ways she sometimes found excessive. She was willing to take calculated risks. He sometimes found reckless, and the truth was usually somewhere between them that they reached by arguing their way to it. About Cord, when Cord wanted to take on a partner, and Elias wasn't sure and she was, and she turned out to be right, and she didn't say so because she didn't need to. About a fence dispute with a neighboring property that Elias wanted to resolve through direct confrontation, and she wanted to resolve through documentation and patience, and they did both, and it worked because of both. They were not a smooth marriage. They'd never been a smooth marriage. They were a working marriage, with all the friction and wear and repair that implied, and the difference between that and a happy marriage was less than people who hadn't been through difficulty together tended to think. She knew things about him that she would not have believed were knowable from the wagon bench on that October afternoon in 1887. She knew the particular way his jaw tightened when he was upset about something he didn't have the words for yet and needed time to find them. She knew that he was better at loss than at waiting. That uncertainty was harder for him than disaster, that he was kinder to animals when he thought no one was watching than when he thought they were. She knew that he read her books when she wasn't home and never mentioned it. And she knew which ones he'd read because of the small tells he'd leave, a thought about something that was in the book, offered casually in conversation, as if it had always been his thought. She found this endearing enough that she never pointed it out directly. She just kept leaving books where he'd find them. Nora Fitch got married in the 10th year to a carpenter who'd come to the valley to help build the new schoolhouse and had stayed because of Nora. She asked Hazel to be at her wedding, which was a small practical affair in the Graves' parlor, and Hazel stood in the back of the room and watched Nora, the frightened young woman who'd been afraid of her own stove, speak her vows with the clear, steady voice of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. Afterward, Nora found her in the yard. "I wouldn't have made it without you," Nora said. "You would have," Hazel said. "It might have taken longer." "Maybe. Nora looked at her with the direct gaze she'd developed over 10 years of frontier living, which was different from the guarded look she'd had in the Graves' kitchen doorway. "You know what I think about sometimes? That first day. The way you looked at my stove before you looked at anything else. I knew the stove was the problem. You walked into a stranger's kitchen and you knew immediately what the actual problem was." Nora shook her head slightly. "I've thought about that a lot. The way you saw what the problem actually was instead of what it looked like." Hazel considered that. She hadn't thought of it as a skill exactly, more as a habit of mind she'd developed because misidentifying problems on the frontier had real consequences, and she'd learned that early. You couldn't solve the problem you thought you had if the problem you actually had was different. "I've been wrong about what the problem was too," she said. "Plenty of times. But you kept looking until you found it. That's all you can do," Hazel said. "Keep looking." Ruth Plank died in the 12th year, in the early fall, of a chest ailment that had been building quietly through the previous winter. She died in her own house, in her own bed, which was what she'd have wanted. She'd told Hazel, in one of the later winter conversations they'd developed the habit of, that she intended to die in Montana and she intended to do it without a great deal of fuss. She had. The fuss came from the people who'd known her, which was most of the valley. At the service, a simple thing in the Methodist hall, because Ruth had been practical about these matters, several people spoke. When Hazel's turn came, she stood at the front of the room and looked out at the faces of people she'd known for 12 years, and she said the thing that seemed truest. "Ruth Plank told me the first year I was here that I was heavier than made sense for this kind of life," she said. There was a small, uncomfortable shift in the room. She was wrong about that, but she said it the way she said everything, as what she believed was true, without softening it to make me feel better. And when she found out she was wrong, she said that directly too. She paused. "I've known a lot of people who couldn't do the second part. The first part is easy. Everyone has opinions. The second part is what makes a person worth knowing." She looked at the wooden box at the front of the room. She was worth knowing. This valley is poor without her, and it wouldn't be what it is if she hadn't been in it. After Clara Hess found her in the yard. Clara was gray at the temples now, solid and comfortable in herself the way some women become in middle age. The self-doubt worn away by the accumulated evidence that they know what they're doing. "That was the right thing to say," Clara said. "It was the true thing," Hazel said. For Ruth, those were usually the same. The ranch in the 15th year was not the ranch that had been on the paper when Hazel arrived. It was a different proposition. More land, better stock, the wells reliable and the fences sound and the accounts showing the kind of consistency that wasn't luck, but the accumulated result of 15 years of decisions being made carefully and corrected when they were wrong. Cord had left in the 8th year to start his own operation 2 valleys over, which they'd helped him do with a loan that he'd repaid in full ahead of schedule and a reference letter that Hazel had written and Elias had signed. He still came by in the falls. They hired 2 hands now, a young man named Deke, who worked quietly and competently, and an older man named Patterson, who'd been running cattle for 30 years and brought a specific knowledge of the grazing land that complemented rather than duplicated what they had. Hazel managed the household accounts and the ranch accounts both, which she'd been doing for years now and which Patterson had initially found surprising in a way he'd been polite about, and then stopped being surprised about when he saw how the numbers worked. The Saturday gathering had become a Tuesday gathering by then, and then 2 gatherings, one for the newer women and one that was more advanced, a distinction that had developed organically and that Hazel thought of as simply the difference between people who needed the foundational things and people who were ready to build on them. She was not the only one teaching anymore. Nora Fitch taught the food preservation section. Addie Graves's daughter, who'd grown up watching the gatherings and absorbed more than anyone had realized, taught the animal husbandry component with a precision that made Hazel think she'd absorbed the approach as well as the content. This was the thing Hazel had come to understand that mattered most about what she'd built. Not the ranch, though the ranch was real and its success was real. Not the legal case, though the 30-year water protection was real and had protected 7 properties through 15 years of an uncertain economy. Not the published guides, though she still received letters about them from women she'd never met in places she'd never been. What mattered most was what reproduced itself. The habit of mind that had gotten her through that first winter. Look for the actual problem, not the apparent one. Learn what you need to learn rather than what would be comfortable. Tell the truth even when the comfortable version is available. That was the thing that had moved outward from her kitchen table into the valley and beyond it, into women she'd never meet who'd read the guides or been taught by someone who'd been taught by her. You couldn't know, really, how far something traveled once you let it go. You could only do the work of understanding what the actual problem was and then doing what the problem required. She was 58 when she sat down one October evening, October again, always October, the month that had started all of it, and wrote a letter to a young woman in Billings who had written to ask her advice about a mail-order marriage she was considering. The young woman had asked practical questions. She'd asked about the physical demands, about how to know if a man was honest, about whether the isolation was survivable, about what to bring and what to leave behind. Hazel sat at the kitchen table with the lamp turned up and the fire going, and Elias reading in the chair by the window. His chair, the chair she still thought of as his chair, even though there were other chairs. And she thought about what she actually knew, after 30 years, that was worth the paper it would take to write it. She wrote, "Bring more than you think you need of practical skills, and less than you think you need of expectations about what the life will look like. The life will not look like what anyone told you. It will be harder in ways you didn't anticipate, and easier in ways you couldn't have imagined, and the ratio between those two things will shift constantly. The isolation is survivable if you're willing to build the thing that makes it survivable, which is connection. Practical, honest, mutual connection with the people around you. No one survives out here alone. Anyone who tells you they did is lying or hasn't been here long enough." She paused and looked at the fire for a moment. As for how to know if a man is honest, watch what he does when something goes wrong and he doesn't know you're watching. Anyone can be patient and reasonable when things are going well. What they are in difficulty is what they actually are. She looked across the room at Elias, who was reading with the lamp close and his brow slightly furrowed the way it got when he was working through something complicated. He hadn't heard her looking, or if he had, he was used to it. They'd spent 30 years in the same rooms, and the comfort of that, the specific, unremarkable comfort of a person who had become as familiar as the furniture and considerably more interesting, was something she hadn't been able to anticipate in October of 1887 when she'd stood on the train platform in Boston and told herself it would be an adventure. It had been. It had been several things she didn't have words for, and one or two she did, and none of them were the things she'd expected, which was probably the only way it could have worked. "One more thing," she wrote at the bottom of the page, in the specific handwriting that 30 years of use had made decisive and clear. "Don't go out there trying to become someone else. Go out there willing to find out who you already are when the circumstances require it. That person is usually more capable than you know. The frontier doesn't build character. It just removes the things that were covering it up." She folded the letter, she addressed it. She set it on the table to go out tomorrow. Elias looked up from his book. "What are you writing?" "Advice," she said. "For who?" "A young woman who's about to do something difficult and is trying to figure out if she should." He looked at her for a moment, the look that had always been there and that she'd spent 30 years learning the full vocabulary of. "What did you tell her?" "The truth," Hazel said, "as best I know it." He nodded slowly and went back to his book. Outside, the October wind moved through the yard in the way it always had, indifferent and constant, the same wind that had been working at this house since long before they'd been in it, and would be working at it long after, pressing against the walls that held, finding the gaps that had been filled, testing the structure that had been built not from expectation, but from everything that expectation had failed to prepare them for. The lamp burned, the fire settled, the accounts were in order, and the stock was in, and the water rights were protected for another 15 years, and the people in this valley knew things they hadn't known before she'd arrived. And she was 58 years old and tired in the satisfied way of someone at the end of a day that was worth the length of it. She had not become someone else. She had become, thoroughly and without apology, herself. And it had turned out that herself, large and bookish and Boston-bred and stubborn and relentlessly practical and capable of walking 200 yards into a blizzard without knowing for certain what she'd find, had been exactly what this particular piece of difficult country needed. She hadn't known that in 1887. She hadn't known it for several years. But that was the nature of the kind of worth that mattered. It didn't announce itself. It proved itself slowly, through the accumulation of days spent doing the actual work. And then one day you looked up and the proof was all around you, in a ranch, and a valley, and a community, and a young woman somewhere who was reading your letter and deciding, because of what it said, to go anyway. That was enough. That was, when she thought about it clearly, everything.